Good morning. We'll call our subcommittee hearing to order. First, I'd like to request that Mr. Mulvaney, the member from South Carolina and a member of the Small Business Committee, be able to participate in today's subcommittee hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Welcome, Mr. Mulvaney. Thank you for participating with us. As we started to have a little bit of discussion before, this is in regards to the crowdfunding portion of the Jobs Act that was passed in April 2012. For some of us here, we have a certain emotional investing to that Jobs Act. I was blessed to have a couple sections of that were pieces of legislation that we had been working on for about a year. One of the great things about the Jobs Act, it was a truly bipartisan, bicameral sort of piece of work. And we built a formula where everyone from Maxine Waters to Barney Frank to Spencer Baucus to even myself found a way to communicate and grind through a series of small bills, ideas for capital formation, where much of my frustration is first, and look, we all know the dance that the SEC has gone through the last 2 years with the chairman, some of the membership, some of those things. But forgive me for reaching down like this, in something that many of us had been hoping would be sort of a smaller egalitarian opportunity for capital raising for the true beginning entrepreneurs, literally the ones that are coming out of their basement, coming out of their garage, because we do have a cap of $1 million. This is the proposed rule set. And when you start to analyze it, at least as we have from our office, you're starting to see total cost by the time you start to capitalize in your legal costs, your accounting costs, other mechanics, when some of your money will have a 20, 30% load factor on that. At this point, you're starting to get into the point where should you be doing it on your credit cards or should you be doing it with your neighborhood loan shark? This wasn't our intention. This was supposed to be that egalitarian access to capital that did a couple things. Helped create a proof of concept because of the participation from either across the country or from within your community, but also provided a level of optionality, saying, I need some capital up to the $250,000, up to this, up to that, to start our idea and sell that idea using today's modern society, that internet. That is my great frustration. One of the things I'm hoping we will acquire from this hearing today is not only sort of an analysis of what's within the rule sets, the proposed rule sets that have come from the SEC, but an understanding we have only a couple more weeks for comments to go in. And much of the testimony from here we intend as an office to package up and send in also as comments. So I beg of you, even beyond your written statements, when we hit Q&A, it's not only here's the problem, but also maybe a suggestion that we could relay to the SEC saying, here's a way how you do it. Yes, you have the investor protections, but you don't create a chilling effect for what I'm hoping is sort of the next generation of sort of that beginning capital raise. And with that, I will... Okay, when the ranking member shows up, we're going to let her do an opening statement. So what we're going to do is actually go right now to our witnesses' opening statements. Jason Best. Our first witness is Jason Best, co-founder and principal of Crowdfunding Capital Advisors CCA, a consulting advisory firm in San Francisco, and co-author of the Crowdfunding Investing Framework used in the original Jobs Act. And actually, I remember some parts of these documents coming across my desk. Prior to his work in crowdfunding investment, Mr. Best was a successful healthcare technology entrepreneur, and most recently was on the executive leadership team of Kinzer Software, ranked by Inc. magazine as one of the fastest growing private companies in the U.S. He is co-founder and co-author of the book Crowdfunding Investing for Dummies. You wrote that with me in mind, didn't you? And earned his MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management in Arizona. Mr. Best, 5 minutes.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Clark, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss the value that crowdfunding can bring to the American small business community, as well as share some new data from the British and U.S. markets that should shed some light on the magnitude of what's really happening in crowdfunding and how the right kind of crowdfunding regulation can enable a new chapter in American small business success. I'd like to thank the members of this committee and both parties within the House at large for their bipartisan and overwhelming support of crowdfunding. As a co-author of the Startup Exemption Framework, I care very deeply about how the market evolves and want to continue to work with Congress and the SEC to create effective regulation for this market. I want to thank the commissioners and staff of the SEC for their willingness to engage in a robust conversation with CIFRA, the crowdfunding industry regulatory organization, and I hope that CIFRA's active engagement was able to demonstrate that the crowdfunding industry is focused on creating an orderly market with access to capital, investor protections, and appropriate regulatory oversight. As a tech entrepreneur and a small business owner, I have real experience in creating products and services, raising capital, and creating jobs. There are a number of good elements in the proposed regulation, but there's also a number of troubling issues. One of the issues I want to highlight today is the accounting requirements for a full CPA audit on firms raising over $500,000. I believe this places an unreasonable burden on entrepreneurs and small business owners and may cause there to be a soft cap on raising money over $500,000 due to the cost that this regulation would impose. I understand the goal of regulation. As the size of capital raised increases, investors want increased disclosure and validation of the state of the business, and we should work to create different technology solutions that can help achieve that. Additionally, if you have to spend 30% of what I raise just to comply with the legal and accounting requirements, as you said, Mr. Chairman, it's sort of like, am I going to use my credit cards or am I going to use this new opportunity? Now, I wanted to share, really moving to sort of looking at the opportunities for crowdfunding, particularly in two studies. Most recently, a study that was done in the UK about the British system, and an example of what light touch regulatory environments can achieve, and really what we hope that it could achieve here in the U.S. And then secondly, one of the most important questions, I think, is after a company raises the capital, what happens then? What happens then to the business, to follow-on investors, and to job creation? So first to the UK study. When we look specifically at this UK study, they've had 3 years of equity and debt-based crowdfunding up and running and a great deal of experience. The UK government utilized a significantly light touch approach, and it's been amazing to see what has developed in that marketplace. The population of the UK is about 61 million, so it's about 20% of the U.S. population. The size of their crowdfinance market doubled nearly between 2012 and 2013. It grew from nearly $800 million in size to over $1.3 billion. And there's a clear, so it demonstrates a clear willingness for both buyers and sellers, investors and contributors to want to engage in this kind of finance. Of those 2013 totals of $1.3 billion, 314 million were individuals lending to small business. 45 million was equity crowdfunding. That was and that growth rate year over year was over 600% growth rate. And equity crowdfunding surpassed rewards-based crowdfunding in the UK in 2013. That's pretty amazing. So collectively in 2013, in the British system, over $500 million was delivered to early stage and small businesses. That's over 5,000 businesses. So, and the report predicts that in 2014, that will increase significantly. If you were to equate that in the U.S. market, that would be 25,000 businesses receiving money across the country. So looking at what businesses are doing post-funding, 3 questions. Number one, does crowdfunding have a positive impact on sales after you achieve your goal? And in fact, it does. We saw a 24% increase in sales net of the crowdfunding raise when they were successful. Number two, were new employees hired? we found that on average 2.2 new employees were hired for companies that successfully raised funds. So people are creating jobs with this money. And finally, what about follow-on investors? Will angel investors and VCs invest in these companies after they've raised money through crowdfunding? Resounding yes was the answer. 28% within 90 days of closing the round, 28% had already closed an angel round of investment. And an additional 43% were in fact in conversations with VCs or with angel investors. And so that's the data I wanted to share this morning. Again, I want to thank the committee for this hearing and for your overwhelming support of crowdfunding. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Best. Our next witness is Daniel Gorfine, Director of Financial Market Policies and Legal Counsel in the Washington office of the Milken Institute, an independent economic think tank where he researches and has written extensively on issues related to crowdfunding provisions in the Jobs Act. Mr. Gorfine received his BA in Economics and International Relations at Brown University and his law degree from the George Washington University School of Law. You have 5 minutes, and as you all know, 5 minutes, when you see yellow, just start talking faster.
Chairman Schweikert, Ranking Member Clark, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on implementation of Title III of the Jobs Act, or what I will refer to as the crowd investing provisions. My name is Daniel Gorfine, and I am the Director of Financial Markets Policy at the Milken Institute's Center for Financial Markets. Today's discussion fits squarely within a number of pillars that guide our work, including expanding access to capital and developing financial innovations. Indeed, the ultimate goal of crowd investing is to responsibly increase capital access for startups and small businesses, especially within industries or regions disfavored by traditional sources of capital. In proposing Title III rules, the SEC has largely used its discretion to positively advance that goal in the development of this market. That said, it is an open question whether the current crowd investing rules will significantly increase capital formation for startups and small businesses. Investors will need to consider whether the risk-reward dynamics are sufficiently compelling and whether other factors such as personal interest and affinity are a sufficient draw. And for issuers and intermediaries, there are concerns that the cost of a Title III raise may exceed the benefit. Based on these concerns, I will briefly discuss suggestions that may foster the development of crowd investing while limiting the downside risk to investors. This approach will allow for the evolution of this market and an opportunity to assess its central hypothesis, that in an interconnected, Internet-centric world, there is wisdom in the crowd. Two principles from the law guide my suggestions today. First, that this capital-raising tool is intended to be relatively low cost, and second, that the Internet can facilitate a novel form of crowd-based due diligence and investment. With these principles in mind, I believe as an initial matter that the most efficient way to limit downside risk is through an emphasis on investor caps, at least until the market is able to prove itself. The SEC's current investor self-certification approach properly imposes responsibility on investors. It should go further, however, by requiring platforms to make investors explicitly aware at the point of investment that the cap is not something that can be ignored, but rather is required by law and intended to protect investors from the downside risk of early-stage investing. Additionally, the SEC should consider precluding an investor who violates the investor caps from bringing a lawsuit against an issuer. With investor caps serving as the most effective way to limit downside risk, the SEC should then minimize non-statutory disclosure requirements. The law already includes a number of baseline disclosure requirements that will help investors make investment decisions. But in aggregate, if additional disclosures are too extensive and ongoing reporting requirements too onerous, then the costs will exceed the benefit, especially given the questionable marginal value of such disclosure to investors. The ultimate success of crowd investing hinges on the effectiveness of new vetting methodologies and criteria generated through the wisdom of the crowd. And evidence from overseas demonstrates that discerning crowd investors are likely to invest in what they know, existing companies with known management teams or known businesses and products. Accordingly, the SEC should first require few, if any, incremental disclosures beyond those already required by law, and second, limit ongoing reporting requirements. A third suggestion is to permit funding portals more leeway to select and list offerings, as well as to share data and information with investors. The law does not allow a funding portal to provide investment advice or recommendations. At its extreme interpretation, this ban could require a platform to list all offerings proposed by issuers. In order to permit platforms some flexibility to decide on which offerings they will list, the SEC proposes that a platform can filter and select offerings based on objective criteria, for example, by geographic region. It also creates a duty for a platform to exclude offerings that could be fraudulent or that raise investor protection concerns. The rules nevertheless leave a gap where a platform could have serious doubts about the viability of an offering, but not to the level that it is permitted to exclude the offering from its platform. To require a platform to list an offering that it has a strong conviction will fail is contrary to promoting investor protection. Accordingly, portals should have the ability to go further in deciding with whom they do business, so long as they do not advertise that their platform has somehow safer or better opportunities. The SEC proposed rules may also prevent platforms from sharing key data and information that could assist crowd investors. As we have seen with the development of e-commerce platforms such as eBay and Amazon, there is significant opportunity for intermediaries to glean and analyze data and develop algorithms to detect fraud or best practices, and also collect user feedback. I would like to see the SEC explicitly permit these types of activities for funding portals. Finally, funding portals should be subject to reduced liability exposure for issuer missteps, given the portal's limited promotional activities, limited ability to exclude offerings, and designed to serve simply as a bulletin board. The SEC's initial contrary interpretation of the law would likely decrease the number of intermediaries participating in this market, as well as increase costs due to the risk of litigation. If that interpretation holds, however, a platform can be on the hook for the missteps of an issuer, then the platform should have greater discretion to decide on whether to do business with that issuer. I would like to thank the committee again for having me join you today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Gorfine. I would like to yield to Ranking Member Clark to introduce the next witness.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's my honor and privilege to introduce to everyone here today Professor Bullard. Professor Mercer Bullard is a securities law professor at the University of Mississippi School of Law and founder and president of the Fund Democracy, a nonprofit investor advocacy organization. He has appeared before congressional committees on more than 20 occasions and is a member of PCAOB's Investor Advisory Group and was a member of the SEC's inaugural Investor Advisory Committee. With prior experience as an assistant chief counsel at the SEC and practicing securities lawyer, he is an expert on the Commission's enforcement and rulemaking practices. He has a JD from the University of Virginia, a master's from Georgetown, and a BA from Yale. I want to thank Professor Bullard for appearing before us today and look forward to your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Clark and Chairman Schweikert and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to appear here today, especially a committee that's focused on business rather than securities, because what I spend most of my time doing is teaching students how to solve business problems. The committee has asked whether the SEC's proposal will work for small businesses, and I'm afraid the answer is probably not, but it's hard to tell. But the question is somewhat unfair because Congress did establish extremely detailed disclosure and filing requirements that are going to make up most of the burdens that will be imposed by crowdfunding. And I also would add that I don't think the solution is reducing those, because I think they're appropriate as investor protection measures to ensure this does not become, does not go the way of the penny stock market in terms of the reputation that crowdfunding develops. As you may know from my prior testimony, my view is that crowdfunding probably could work if investment minimums were so low and the risk of loss was small, so that virtually no regulation at all would be required. It's not clear to me why we could not allow any business to offer a $100 share to a company or to an investor, simply having provided a business plan on the Internet, leaving only the anti-fraud provisions of the securities laws and general consumer law to protect those investors. But the current law is what we have, so I'll turn to some of the specific aspects of the SEC's proposal to apply the SEC's proposal and their effect on small businesses. Now, one issue that we talked about before the meeting is there's $1 million cap on what a crowdfunding issuer is allowed to have sold, and the statute clearly indicates that's all securities. And the SEC has interpreted that to mean that it does not include all securities, it includes only crowdfunding securities. So what that means is somebody could go out and raise $10 million or $100 million or $1 billion and then do a $1 million crowdfunding offering. Congress imposed that $1 million cap because crowdfunding was supposed to be for small issuers. It was supposed to be for issuers raising small dollar amounts. It was supposed to be for issuers that suffer from a perceived funding gap between them and larger businesses. Under the SEC's approach, medium and large businesses may fill the crowdfunding space, crowding out the small businesses for which it was created. Small businesses should also be concerned about the SEC's position on certain investor protections. The reason is that if it is easy for unscrupulous businesses to raise capital through crowdfunding, the crowdfunding market may become equated, as I mentioned, to the market for penny stocks, rather than the thriving market for exciting investment opportunities that it does have the potential to become. For example, the Commission would permit issuers to offer investors who invest early a larger share of any oversubscription amount. The stampede effect that this promotes is precisely why such first-come, first-served tender offers are prohibited under the Williams Act. What kind of businesses are going to allocate oversubscriptions on a first-come, first-served basis in order to stampede investors to make commitments? It will be the less scrupulous ones that honest businesses should not want in their crowdfunding marketplace. The Commission would permit issuers to use financial statements that are 16 months stale. That means that you could start a business in December of year 1, you could do a crowdfunding offering in April of year 3, and your financial statements would cover 1 month at the beginning of the life of the business, covering only 1 out of its 17-month lifespan. The Commission would permit crowdfunded issuers that have failed to file their annual report, the only post-offering obligation they have, for up to 23 months to go ahead and make another crowdfunding offering. What kind of businesses are going to take advantage of the opportunity to file financial information that is 16 months stale or are willing to violate the law by failing to file their annual report? And I believe it's the unscrupulous businesses that honest businesses should not want in their crowdfunding marketplace. Small businesses should also be concerned about investors suffering financial distress as a result of an investment, which is more likely due to certain SEC positions. For example, the Commission would permit investors to self-certify their financial qualifications. And this will result, for example, in some investors mistakenly believing they can count their home toward their net worth, in which case their crowdfunding investment may end up representing a large part of their savings. Small businesses should be concerned about this issue because the defining feature of the crowdfunding market may end up being the high frequency of investments going to zero and how that plays out. Estimating conservatively 1/4 of crowdfunding investments are going to be worthless in 3 years. The data suggests the failure rate may be closer to 1/2. Imagine the reputation of a family of mutual funds in which 1/4 to 1/2 of the funds lost 100% of their value every 3 years. So how will this narrative play out? Will the losses be only a small part of an investor's portfolio, money they can afford to lose? Or is the narrative going to be about investors who lost money they couldn't afford to lose, their life savings perhaps? You can stack up a pile of filings and disclosure as high as the sky. But the bottom line is the success or failure of crowdfunding is likely to turn on the losses that investors suffer, and there are going to be a lot of total losses, are losses that they can afford. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions that you might have.
Our next witness is DJ Paul, co-founder of Crowdfund Intermediary Regulatory Advocates. You couldn't have come up with a shorter name. A trade association for crowdfunding web portals. He is also the co-chief strategy officer with Gate Impact, based in New York, where he develops solutions to facilitate and expand private and alternative asset transactions. Prior to joining Gate, Mr. Paul co-founded Crowdfunder, a Los Angeles-based crowdfunding intermediary platform. Mr. Paul earned a BA in philosophy from Brown University. Well, please wax philosophy towards us. 5 minutes, Mr. Paul.
Chairman Zwiker, Ranking Member Clark, and other members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's an honor to be here. Given the limited time for testimony, I'll confine my comments to 4 salient issues. These 4 issues certainly representative of the kinds of concerns which some in the industry have with respect to the proposed regulations, but they're by no means exhaustive. First, audit requirements, which Mr. Best was good enough to touch on, pooled investment restrictions, intermediary participation restrictions, and funding portal liability. Audit requirements. As currently proposed, there are 3 tiers of financial disclosures, disclosure requirements for Title III offerings, corresponding roughly to the the amount raised. First tier is 0 to 100,000. Second tier is 100,000 to 500,000, and the third tier is to 500,000 from 500,000 to 1 million. The first tier requires disclosure of financial statements certified by an executive officer of the company. The second tier requires the financial statements reviewed by an accountant. However, the third tier requires CPA audited financials. Furthermore, these requirements for such CPA audited financials are on an ongoing basis. Such audited financials are provided to investors every year following a Title III raise over $500,000. It's worth noting that these disclosure requirements for the third tier are actually more onerous and exhaustive than the current requirements for Regulation D offerings, which does not mandate audited financial statements for issuers, nor ongoing annual audited disclosures. These overly onerous requirements for third tier of security crowdfunding offerings may have the unintended effect of pushing potential issuers away from doing Title III entirely and towards perhaps Regulation D offerings, which might be more attractive to potential issuers. This seems clearly inconsistent with the spirit of the original legislation. In effect, this may create a donut hole between 500,000 and 1 million, where offerers do not utilize Title III at all. And in addition to creating an artificial market irregularity, this will also have the unfortunate effect of making these offerings unavailable to unaccredited investors, since Regulation D, which is the most viable alternative, obviously does not permit investment by unaccredited investors. Moving on to pooled investment restrictions. The proposed regulations exclude funds from utilizing Title III to raise capital, in effect requiring all crowdfunding investments to be direct investments. This rule would restrict pooled investments or hedge funds, private equity, from raising money through crowdfunding. While most of us can agree that most funds are not suitable issuers for crowdfunding, we believe that this restriction may be overbroad, as it appears to restrict the fundraising of special purpose vehicles or single purpose entities investing only in a single operating company that would otherwise qualify as an eligible Title III issuer. This restriction does not serve to protect investors, but rather this restriction actually succeeds in denying crowdfunding investors some of the advantages and protections afforded to other investors and institutions in other asset classes, particularly those utilized in Regulation D. Moving on to intermediary participation restrictions. Current proposed regulations would restrict intermediaries from holding interests in the companies conducting Title III offerings on their platforms. This serves to restrict intermediaries from participating alongside their investors in these offerings. Rather than diminishing a theoretical conflict of interest between intermediaries and investors, as a practical matter, this restriction effectively forbids alignment of interests between investors and intermediaries. This concept is often described as skin in the game. We believe that intermediaries who invest in issuers make for better alignment of interests. We believe that allowing such co-investment by intermediaries would have two very desirable benefits for investors. First, an investor may take comfort in knowing that the intermediary facilitating the transaction is invested in the same deal and on the same terms in the investment that they are considering. And second, when an intermediary has such skin in the game, that fact itself may encourage the intermediary to take more seriously their assigned roles in the marketplace. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'll just very quickly skip to funding portal liability, just so that I'll have an opportunity perhaps to answer some questions that you might have with respect to that. As the regulations are currently written or proposed, it may be subject to the interpretation that issuers, rather that intermediaries are considered issuers within the context of the liability of any omissions that might be made by an issuer. This would have a rather bizarre effect of making an intermediary responsible, effectively a guarantor of any offering that appeared on its platform. I think that it's pretty obvious that would be problematic on its face, and it's something that we need to address in the next several weeks, and certainly before these regulations become finalized. I'll end there, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. And I was going to turn to Ranking Member Clark and let her share with us her opening statement.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome our witnesses and thank them for their testimony here this morning. With traditional capital access avenues still relatively constrained, an increasing number of entrepreneurs are turning to crowdfunding to launch their enterprises. In 2012 alone, crowdfunding injected $2.7 billion into new ventures, a figure that will likely increase moving forward. In accordance with the Jumpstart Our Business Startup or Jobs Act of 2013, the SEC published its proposed rule for implementing the crowdfunding provisions in October of last year. While the SEC's crowdfunding disclosure requirements are aimed at providing enough information to the public to facilitate prudent investment decisions and minimize fraud, there is some concern that some of the disclosure requirements will make crowdfunding offerings cost prohibitive. The SEC, for example, has estimated that it could initially cost $15,000 in listing fees and regulatory compliance expenditures to raise $50,000, thus taking resources away from business expansion and working capital. While these costs are likely to decrease over time as equity crowdfunding becomes more popular, it is vital that Congress monitor the SEC's crowdfunding rollout and make changes if necessary to improve access to capital for small businesses while preventing bad actors from defrauding the public. I'd like to thank our witnesses for lending their expertise and insights to this second examination of today's subject matter, the rule, and the SEC's crowdfunding proposal. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Clark. I'm going to turn to Mr. Mulvaney for the first 5 minutes of questions.
Sure. Just a couple of random questions to the various members of the panel. Thank you, gentlemen, again for doing this. And thank you for participating. I don't think a lot of folks realize how important this is because it helps drive the national debate on the issue. So I appreciate your time. Mr. Paul, we'll start with you just because you said a couple things that stood out. You said that because of the audited financial requirements to Tier 3 offerings, it's actually technically easier or cheaper to use a Reg D offering. What does a CPA audit cost these days?
I actually, there's some debate about this. I mean, it could be $10,000, it could be $20,000, it could be $5,000. It's not going to be insignificant. There's some discussion about whether or not it'll be streamlined. A lot of the requirements, audited financials the cost of audited financials obviously are going to be contingent on how much to some extent, how much activity the business, how far along it is in its business cycle. A startup, it would be, more readily, a company that has no history. Pretty much all that you're buying there is the CPA's license.
And before I get to the Reg D question, how do you audit a company that doesn't exist?
I'm not smart enough to answer that question.
So if I really
that would be a challenge. I agree.
If Mr. Schweiker and I have an idea, and my understanding is that this is actually being used in the music industry a good bit. He and I want to do a record together. We want to cut an album. It sounds like I'd be completely excluded from the Tier 3 because I can't audit something that doesn't exist, can I?
You certainly could have an accountant look at what you don't have and say, I'm certifying that you don't have the thing that you said you don't have.
True. How much can I raise at a Reg D offering?
There's no limit.
So if it's easier to do Reg D than it is to do a Tier 3, you wonder why anybody would do a Tier 3.
Well, you would do you might do it for several reasons. First of all, it's not clear that it's going to be necessarily less expensive. This is one specific requirement that exists in the Tier 3 of Title 3 offerings of crowdfunding that doesn't exist in Regulation D. There are other requirements in Regulation D as well. However, you might again, Regulation D is limited to accredited investors, and there are certain ideas, certain ventures. Perhaps your record idea that might be more appealing from an investor base of unaccredited investors. So that might be a motivating factor to not go up to Reg D.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Mr. Gorfine, you said something regarding limited promotional activities. What are you not allowed to do as a portal?
Yeah, so funding portals are quite restricted in what they can do with the offerings that are listed on their site. So they cannot be going out and soliciting for that offering or sending out messages saying, we've got this great offering on our platform, you should come check out your new record album company. So they really are the idea behind the funding portals as opposed to a registered broker-dealer platform, which would have more ability to kind of provide advice and recommendations. A funding portal is envisioned to be a bulletin board. It's a Craigslist for offerings. So really you just go to the platform, you'll be directed to the platform where you can then sort through the different offerings, but the portals themselves cannot do anything further to be promoting those offerings on their site.
Gotcha. Finally, Dr. Bullard, I'm all for solving problems. I'm a little concerned about creating problems that don't exist. If I've just raised $1 billion in the public markets, why would I raise $250,000 on a crowdfunding site?
The reason is that I would certainly think Twitter, when it was private, would think it would be a great social media strategy to do $1 million funding through crowdfunding to reach out to its users who aren't accredited investors. So I think there are a lot of instances. But the issue isn't necessarily whether it's $1 billion or 10 million or whatever. The idea is this space will be used more often by larger companies if you allow really large companies to participate. So if you allow companies that are raising $10 million into the space, it is going to have the effect of squeezing out, or at least they'll be competing with all the small businesses that it's purportedly designed for. So I don't know if $1 million is the right cap, but having no cap at all will leave the space open to whoever can pay the most for the services.
Right, and I guess I just look at the numbers of it and the math of it. I don't know. This is fairly expensive money. I mean, in the greater scheme of things, it's not. And it's one of the reasons we're having the hearing. It's not as easy and efficient and as cheap as we hoped it would be to raise money through crowdfunding. So I guess I'm struggling with why I would go raise $250,000 of a very expensive money when I just raised some of the cheapest $100 million, billion that I possibly could. So I recognize there are challenges. I'm wondering if that's one of the ones we actually spend a lot of our time on. Anyway, I appreciate the Chairman's time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mulvaney. Ranking Member Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield the time to Representative Chu at this time.
Ms. Chu, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for yielding. Well, I'm a member of the Intellectual Property Subcommittee on the Judiciary Committee, and so I am concerned about intellectual property, and I know the protection of intellectual property is one of the challenges of crowdfunding. So I have a question for anybody on the panel. Once an idea is out, the startup of small business runs the risk that the idea will be stolen or copied. How can inventors and artists protect themselves from those consequences? Let's say, for instance, that a tech startup has a new technology that's not been patented, but they use crowdfunding to raise capital for their venture. Should intermediaries be required to advise or educate issuers on IP protections before a campaign is posted or disclosed?
I mean, the same risks exist whenever one raises money. Whether or not intermediaries should be required to advise issuers as to that, it's certainly something that I don't believe that the intermediaries that are part of our organization would have any objection to that being something that we would want to do. But I'm not sure whether or not there are certainly going to be some ideas that maybe aren't well suited to the broad raising of capital through this because of intellectual property concerns. But the majority of the ideas, I think, can be protected. You mentioned patents, and of course there are other ways of protecting idea. And it will encourage, we hope, issuers to be organized and get their intellectual property as well as their other issues in order prior to doing a raise in this manner.
Mr. Best.
In addition to Mr. Paul's comments, I think that what we're also seeing on a mechanical basis in implementation are the fact that many crowdfunding platforms, and I would assume soon all, will have deal rooms, online deal rooms, where there's a public-facing amount of information that anyone can see, but that any IP, anything that would be restricted, the viewer would need to gain an additional level of access from the entrepreneur, that they could pass through some sort of screen that the entrepreneur could determine this is a serious investor, this is someone who actually wants to make an investment in my business, and I'll allow that to happen. Same thing that occurs in the offline world today through many 506 offerings.
Yeah, if I could just add. I would say, to answer the question about liability, I think we need to leave intermediaries to just what legal rights the issuers would have under current law. There may be some duties that they would be impliedly having in that scenario, but I certainly wouldn't make it any kind of statutory or rule-based requirement.
Yeah, I would agree that this is not appropriate to put the requirement on a platform necessarily to educate the entrepreneur or the issuer, but I think it raises an important question, which is how do we make sure that issuers and entrepreneurs are educated about some of the risks of a crowd fund or a crowd raise? So I think that education for issuers and entrepreneurs is going to be very important, and one suggestion I would have is that the SEC actually has an investor.gov website that has a lot of great information for investors. perhaps through the education side of the SEC's organization, you could create some information for issuers and entrepreneurs that they could consult before they go ahead and do a crowd raise. So I think that the education component is important.
Thank you for that. Professor Bullard, given the inherent riskiness of small business investing and the lack of investor sophistication in individual retail investors, it was mentioned today that the best way to limit downside risk is through an emphasis on the investor caps. However, the proposed rules do not require crowdfunding platforms to verify the income and net worth stated by the investors. What are the implications of this, and furthermore, what mechanism should be used to ensure the compliance of the investor caps?
Well, there are really two problems here. One is the very real possibility that people will lose a significant amount of money that they can't lose. And obviously that will have happened only because something has gone wrong in the application of the Act. One of the really great things the Jobs Act did was actually to impose percentage limits. So that implies that you can only put a certain amount of risk, which is a great defense to allowing people to take those kinds of risks. But people will slip through the cracks. It's inevitable. And something more needs to be done than simply to allow an investor to go on a website on an unguided basis and just say, I've got $1 million in net worth. And I can tell you most investors are going to think that their house is included in that, which it is not. And most investors are going to neglect the fact that they don't own their house. The bank actually does. So you could have people investing perhaps all of their savings in an offering because of that confusion. You can't go out and sit down in a room with an investor and go over all of their qualifications. But on the other hand, Mr. Gorfine suggests that we actually sue investors who violate the provision. Well, you can't violate the provision. The provision doesn't say that investors are required to be X. It says that issuers aren't allowed to sell to those people. The obligation is on the part of the issuer and the intermediary, and they're the ones who are really responsible. So the SEC needs to step it up a little bit, but we all know that it can't be sending lots of papers that have to be reviewed on a detailed basis.
I see my time's run out, so I'll yield back.
Thank you for that. Mr. Rice, 5 minutes. You're going to, and who do you want to yield to? In that case, I get to. And what's always dangerous here is, and Ms. Clark and I have teased over this in the past, I'm trying to do questions without too much in the tirades. But I do need to actually just sort of throw a personal philosophic sharing, particularly for my philosophy major at the end. As much of the political side and the latest political discussion is income disparities. But yet, in many ways, we've diced up part of our opportunity within our society, saying, I'm a qualified investor, so I'm part of this fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of my U.S. population. You get to participate. You get to know what's going on. You get to take risk. But the vast majority of our society and population, you are walled off from opportunities. And yes, people lose money. But as we've all had in our experiences, you know, we invest in 3 things. One we do okay in, and actually over time we do well in it. The other 2 go nowhere. But that's how we've built, you know, our nest egg for our retirements and our future. And as some of the rule sets become more paternalistic, my fear is we've just expanded that income inequality by sort of almost a financial apartheid, where we say, if you have this wealth, you get to participate. If you don't get to even know. So I do have an underlying belief system here that we have sort of this egalitarian obligation to reach out to. If you're an electrical engineer and you're an expert, but you don't have the $1 million in the bank, but damn it, you have $2,000 and you're an expert, should you be allowed to invest it? And that was actually one of my great hopes underneath the crowdfunding is, how do I really create an opportunity society and not one that's walled off where you have it so you get to continue to participate? And this sort of makes the circle back to Mr. Paul, back to sort of the question. My fear was in some of the reading our office did within the proposed rule sets that a platform, an intermediary, may actually find itself within the tree of liability. A, do they get to sort of choose who they post up? if so, do they now start to sort of only choose opportunities that they feel are perfectly safe, or do they have to post up anything within their general box saying geographic are these things? And do they end up carrying liability for a failed disclosure or someone's bad act?
There are a few questions in there, so let me start with what I think was the first one. Understand that and I'm sure you do because I know you participated in the creation of the statute itself, but investment advice is not permitted to be given by funding portals to investors. So the question that you're asking about whether or not a portal can pick and choose which offerings it puts up gets close to the line of whether or not that, in effect, if you exclude something and you include something, if that constitutes investment advice. CIFRA, the organization I work with, has been working with the SEC to fine-tune that a little bit, put a little bit more shape on exactly what that is, so that we don't have a situation where all portals have to list everything, which would be a bulletin board and not really in keeping with what the intent was. But nor can they be quite so selective that it's pretty obvious that they're picking the winners because they can't offer the investment advice. So I think that might be responsive to the first part of your question.
Okay, go on to the second part because
in terms of the liability, yeah, that there's the definition of issuer as it relates to Title III offerings is broad enough now to include not just the issuer itself, but to include the portal. And then the liabilities that the issuer quite rightly has for being truthful and disclosing accurately, then if the portal is considered an issuer, then the responsibility and the liability would then fall to the portal. That seems overbroad. That seems like it's going to dissuade would-be portals from participating in the process.
Can I put a hold on you for there
Certainly.
at that point? Does everyone on the panel agree that a clean reading of sort of the proposed rule set does that cascade of liability? And then we're going to...
Yeah, what Mr. Paul is talking about is there's liability for violating Section 5, which basically means you haven't complied with the exemption. As it turns out, it wasn't available. And generally, issues are the intermediaries are not going to be subject to that. And to the extent they might be, that's certainly a legitimate concern.
Okay.
And then there's the secondary liability, which you're also talking about, which is material misstatements. And they're squarely in the crosshairs on that. And Congress specifically put 12A2 in the Act. So there's no question there.
Ms. Gorfine, you agree?
Yeah, I would say it's the SEC has interpreted the Title III to potentially impose that liability on funding portals. I think that there's something, I think it's not clear from the statute, though, whether a funding portal should fall within the purview of that type of liability because they are not able to fully decide who they're listing on their platform. And there's something that there's a limited promotional aspect of what they're doing. There's a limited solicitation aspect of what they're doing, which raises questions. How can you be held liable for the misstatement of an issuer or an omission of an issuer if you didn't have the ultimate discretion of whether to list that offering on your platform or not? So I view this on a bit of a sliding scale. To the extent that platforms don't have the discretion to decide with whom they do business, it seems like a poor outcome for them to be liable.
Okay. Mr. Best, and I
think from my perspective, we believe that portals should have the ability to decide who is and is not on their platform because then it becomes more than a bulletin board. Then it becomes.
But on the taking liability for if
I agree.
Okay.
If I could just, there's a significant disagreement we haven't covered.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to come back to you because, Mr. Paul, because there was a couple things in your written testimony that were actually very interesting. Mr. Paul.
Yes, sir.
So I interrupted you when I went on my tirade.
Yes, I wasn't sure if that was a tirade or you were just looking for
No, I'm trying to get,
because
I actually, believe it or not, within your written testimonies, I have a bit of a split on the discussion of does the portal, what level of liability it takes for a screwed-up offering or someone forgetting a disclosure. And so that's what I'm trying to...
It will always get back down to, when there's a claim, if there's a claim, what did the portal know and when? And the liability could be significant. I mean, it could be significant enough that effectively, and I mentioned this very briefly in my oral testimony, but it is in my written testimony, in the broadest interpretation, the portal could be 100% liable for reimbursing an investor, even after the investor perhaps doesn't even own the security any longer, which would effectively make the portal a guarantor for everything that's listed on the platform.
And that's I am concerned about the potential chilling effect, and just crisping up that language. Professor, you actually you sort of brushed alongside this, and can I throw a scenario at you and have you sort of game theory this with me? They're actually a group of friends and supporters. It's a Korean business association. At one time, if it was a few years ago, they were trying to put up a community bank, but the difficulties and the capital that's required to that. And they've been looking at the idea of, hey, if we could produce a portal and we could reach out to the Southwest and the California market and help folks within our association group, have basic capital raise and their level of comfort, because these are often folks either they know reputation-wise or they know the industries. Do I have problems with something that borders on a fraternal or business or chamber or specialty organization setting up a portal saying this is what we're going to fund? That's the first question. Do you see anything there in a portal being that specific to its charter?
Yeah, the disagreement is that there is no restriction on your ability to say no to issuers. That is simply incorrect. To be fair to the SEC, the investment advice issue, that goes to the communications with the public, the investor. Deciding who's going to list is a communication with the issuer.
Okay, so Korean
that's not an issue.
Association,
right?
And you can, instead of a
and,
community bank,
right.
This is how we're going to help.
Right. So
folks
there
in
should
our
be
community.
no problem. Now you can't say you should invest in these affinity entities because you'll get better returns.
Yeah.
But you can say you can invest in these affiliated entities, and you can probably say because we think they have values that we share. But there is no conceivable possibility that you chose the group on that basis, or you went out and you only accepted issuers you thought would be 10-baggers that you would be liable for that. That is simply not realistic.
Well, as a professor of securities law, as you probably remember, a decade or two ago, there was a movement to try to create specialty community banks to be able to deal with underserved populations. Do you see where some of this model could actually be part of that opportunity?
Yes, but we talked before the hearing about the issue of whether you can actually do bricks and mortar selling, and I'm still not totally clear on that. But I think that to the extent the SEC has
could you explain that for everyone
right.
else here, because this one actually could be a bottleneck.
Right. Well, the SEC talks about kind of an online-only approach. And if I'm correct that would preclude you from running an offering out of your bank, you would still have to have a website, but you wouldn't be limited to the website. Then I think that would severely handicap what is really the sweet spot of crowdfunding. That's the community business that somebody might want to start up based on local relationships. For example, the organization you mentioned.
Okay. And Mr. Best, as the professor was just touching on, isn't the second part of the beauty within sort of the crowdsourcing, crowdfunding concept is just that. It's a proof of concept.
Absolutely.
It's not only maybe raising money in my community, but also a and B test of not only I can access some money, but I can also accept folks that have enthusiasm for the concept.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. I think what we're seeing are there are a number of angel investors who now are beginning to look at crowdfunding as a qualifying step before they will look at a deal. Because do you have a customer? For your product? Do you have a customer for your service? And being able to, whether it be through rewards or through equity or debt, being able to establish that, that does several things. It's proof of concept of your product. It's a proof of concept of you as an entrepreneur, the ability to execute, and your ability to raise capital, both very important aspects.
Well, Mr. Gorfine, in that sort of model is, let's say I actually need a few $1 million for my concept. But I'm going to use crowdfunding to raise $499,000, and we'll discuss whether that ultimately I have a soft cap. In small raise, because in that population, most likely I'm not going to have many people able to invest over $2,000, and at some point we really do need to talk that there are these investment caps already built into here to limit someone's downside. But I use that as my proof of concept. Then I take my proof of concept, and can I then go and to my qualified investors and raise my next $2 million, and then go to more institutional money to round out my fundraise?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the SEC, I think, did a great job in clarifying that point, that you would be able to use Title III alongside or before or subsequent to certain other exemptions. So if you think about this in its totality, what I like about the Jobs Act vision is that it creates this kind of seamless capital access pipeline, if implemented effectively, so that you can go from each stage of the development of a company and be able to access capital that suits your needs at whatever stage of development you're at, so that you certainly could start with Title III and then potentially use that to move up to a Title IV, Reg A plus type raise.
All right. Thank you. That was one of the concepts I wanted to make sure we had crisped up. Ranking Member Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Paul, the SEC has estimated that commissions to intermediaries will account for about 5 to 15% of the crowdfunding issuance, higher than other funding sources such as public stock offerings or bond issuances. Do you expect this higher cost to come down and become competitive with traditional forms of capital as crowdfunding expands? And then I'll open up to the rest of the panel.
I think it's going to be a competitive marketplace. So if you're asking if over time that these commissions, that there will be some sort of competition, I think the answer is probably yes. I would, however, note that comparing crowdfunding, the commissions for crowdfunding offerings to IPOs or public markets is perhaps not the most apt analogy. I mean, it is an appropriate one, but there are other types of securities that exist that might be a closer analogy. For example, Regulation D or 506, which is another type of private placement. And in that universe, these proposed commissions are fairly consistent, maybe a touch higher, but not quite as many multiple higher as the proper public markets.
Do you agree with Mr. Paul's assessment?
I would, yes.
Okay. Professor Bullard, the rule outlines a number of investment limits based on an investor's income level. However, you express concern that the rules lack an income verification scheme. What risk does this pose for investors interested in crowdfunding?
The risk is not that they'll invest in accordance with the rules. I think the rules are good rules, particularly that they limit the percentage with respect to the person's income or net worth. This is a slip through the cracks problem, and that is most likely to happen when you put the entire analysis in the investor's hands and you don't give them clear markers as to things they need to look out for. So, for example, one obvious one would be they should not be allowed to self-certify if there hasn't been a button they had to push saying, I have not included the value of my home. There should not be. They should not accept that they've read, the investor education material, which is required, unless there are a couple of screens where a box has said in big bold letters the percentage of small businesses that fail, to really drive home the point that this happens. Instead, what the SEC suggested is you can just click on a box that says, I've read this, and the thing isn't even there, or something you would have to scroll down 20 pages. And we all check that box all the time saying we read it. But we're lying, aren't we? Right? So, but it's also crazy to think anybody's going to read these things. So the SEC has always been unwilling to say, well, the literal letter of the law is the only opportunity, is the only path we can go down, or no requirement. I mean, just be creative and say, look, there are 4 or 5 boxes with big fat letters that will lay out the key things they need to think about, and that should do it. And that's the kind of thing we need to deal with. But they're not going to be able. I think submitting a pay stub should be a requirement. That's just too easy, or some electronic verification of income, for example.
So discuss that an ambiguity in the rule that could allow large companies to raise $1 million through crowdfunding while simultaneously raising more via other public offerings. Can you elaborate on how this will impact startups and small businesses that are experiencing a funding gap and want to seek crowdfunding?
This is the issue Representative Mulvaney raised, and I agree that the $1 million cap on the total offerings that a crowdfunding issuer is allowed is too low. But I think as a business matter, this is not an investor protection issue at all, but as a business matter, if you really want crowdfunding to work, I think that larger issuers are going to squeeze out smaller issuers. And you all know in the regulatory space who calls the shots. In the regulatory space, it's going to be the largest regulated entities. So if you allow larger entities in this regulatory space, they're going to have more influence with the SEC. The rules are going to reflect their interests. So definitely, I think the $1 million is not high enough. I don't think the SEC has the authority to do what it's doing because the statute is so unambiguous. But the fact that somebody can be very successful raising significant amounts elsewhere, they should not be allowed to use crowdfunding because I think the way it's going to work is they will squeeze out the small businesses.
Let me open this up to the rest of the panel. I saw, I guess, a glimmer in your eye, Mr. Paul. Would you like to share your thoughts?
It might have been a glimmer. With all due respect to Professor Bullard, I just don't agree. I don't think that the larger issue, if the larger issuers or whatever larger entities are allowed to do crowdfunding offerings, that it's going to squeeze anybody out. It'll simply make it a more diverse marketplace. I mean, somebody that I'm trying to think of a large corporation that might choose to utilize Title III in order to almost as a marketing opportunity or a way of extending their brand. It's still going to be limited to $1 million, at least for the time being. Why would we restrict that? Why is that a bad thing? Why not allow the opportunity to invest for unaccredited investors that would not otherwise have had that opportunity? I'm cognizant, of course, that this is the Small Business Committee, and so that we want to foster small businesses, and certainly Professor Bullard's comments are consistent with that. However, the other side of the rationale for Title III was to democratize wealth creation as well. So it's not just democratizing the capital formation, but also democratizing the opportunity for investors to participate in the types of investors that they might not otherwise and previously didn't otherwise have. So I don't see the need to restrict them.
Mr. Gorfine, Mr. Best.
Well, in talking to a couple of major corporations about this who have been interested in crowdfunding, their interest really is more on the reward side because of the rewards crowdfunding like Kickstarter or using services like that, because it allows them to raise capital. There are no limits and far fewer restrictions. And knowing how general counsels at corporations tend to work, that would be the way that a marketing department might have a better chance of actually executing one of these campaigns. So I think I don't believe it'll crowd out small businesses. I think that those major corporations will utilize other means of rewards or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I tend to agree with that. I think let the marketplace determine what the crowd wants to invest in, and I think more opportunities, more offerings and options is not necessarily a bad thing. And if I may, can I come back to your the investor cap question that you were asking before? I do want to just clarify one thing. By no means do I think the SEC should be going after investors with lawsuits if they violate the caps. So I actually do agree to a significant extent with Professor Bullard that this idea of how do we make sure investors just understand what these caps are all about. So what I would propose is just literally at the point that an investor is about to click their commitment, there can be a pop-up that explains the rule and how you calculate what your cap may be. And just explains why that's important. So I do agree with the self-certification aspect of it, but it could just be an explicit pop-up that occurs at the point of the commitment that explains what the parameters are. And my point on the lawsuits is if an investor violates that cap, you can consider whether they should not have the right to bring a cause of action against an issuer. That was what I was bringing up in terms of lawsuits, just to help enforce the importance of that cap.
Very well, thank you. And just one final question, and I'm going to start with Professor Bullard. The SEC cost estimates for crowdfunding do not look promising for small issuers. Are there ways that SEC could reduce the cost without impacting investor protection?
That depends on to what extent the SEC believes it can disregard what was expressly required in the statute. And the SEC has shown a great willingness to do that in its proposal. So if that is what it's going to do, then yes. And one example that really stands out is the requirement that you explain how you valued the shares and how you're going to value them in the future, which you don't have to do anything similar for an IPO. And it's also sort of in contravention of the general rule that you're trying to sell things for the highest price you can get. Although, ironically, in IPOs, you're often trying to sell them for less than you can get in order to have an effect on the aftermarket. So that should go away. It is unreasonable. The very detailed instructions on explaining your capital structure should go away. The very detailed explanations on dilution. What they need to know is we can make subsequent offerings of shares, and it can result in reducing the value of your shares, and we have the authority to do that. So a lot of the things just aren't the kinds of things that are going to go to the real issue here, which is there are going to be a lot of losses. And who are the people who suffered those losses going to be, right? And it's really, I don't think this is going to be about disclosure, but it's certainly, the cost is certainly going to go to disclosure, and the perceived liability is going to go to that as well.
Thank you, Professor. Is there anyone else who would want to? Mr. Bass?
Just one thing about education. I mean, I think that's one of the good things in the statute was the requirement for robust investor education. And we've already begun seeing some of the portals who are going to be implementing solutions that look very much like what Professor Bullard was talking about, whether they be a video much like the seatbelt video you watch when you get on the airplane, or something that has large check boxes and really requires much more engagement. There were other solutions that used to require you to spend a certain amount of time on the page and sort of monitor that. Also, because all this is happening on websites, everything's tracked. And so there'll be a digital footprint of everything that was done by that investor on those sites. And so you'll know how many minutes they spent on each page of disclosure, how many times they watched the video, how many times they did everything. And so it will provide much more transparency than we've ever had before about what people are doing when they're reviewing documents.
Very well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your expertise today.
Thank you, Ranking Member Clark. And I'm going to go to Mr. Rice. But, Professor, I want to chime in on this one just quickly. I actually see as substantially more benefits for its larger organizations. From their standpoint, they get to do a proof of concept. But I actually also saw that as they would have the resources to have good documentation, good video, good information, maybe a nice blog that explains what they're doing. And it's a way of their resources helping introduce, hopefully, this next class of investor to this concept. And, as we keep saying, education, 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 well, I'd love to exploit some of their resources to do that. So that's where I have some optimism. Mr. Rice, 5 minutes.
I was a tax lawyer and a CPA for 25 years before I came to Congress, and can I take you to punch that button? Is it on? Okay, you may have to creep up. Hello? Hello? Test, test. Hello? You have a dead mic. Is that better? I was a tax lawyer and a CPA for 25 years before I came to Congress, and I've represented 1,000 small businesses, and I have seen the effect of federal securities laws on their ability to raise capital. A truly small business that's simply out of reach. Banks being the primary source of capital, the new Dodd-Frank regulations are certainly going to limit that even further. So this is an incredibly important concept, very innovative concept, could solve a big problem of growing small businesses. I totally agree. What I would ask each one of you for one suggestion, we can't make this so complex and complicated and expensive that it, like the rest of the federal securities laws, is out of reach of the average small business. So I'd ask each one of you for one concrete change or suggestion that we could do with these regulations and this law to make it more accessible. And I'll start with you, Mr. Best.
I think it would be to modify the requirement of a full CPA audit at above $500,000 to potentially the CPA review that was required in the $100,000 to $500,000 range.
Mr. Gorfine?
Yeah, I would say in the same vein, I would limit any non-statutory disclosure requirements, and that also includes limiting some of the ongoing compliance requirements. I would just add to the point on audits above $500,000. For a Reg A offering up to $5 million, we don't have that same financial audit requirement. So you want to kind of square how these different exemptions fit together.
Mr. Best, at what level would you require an audit?
I don't have the benefit of 25 years of tax CPA experience. I just come at this as a small business person, as a small business owner. I think there is some level. But I think that if you wanted to say that maybe at the end of year one, after you were successful at raising the capital at the end of year one, and you wanted to then provide something back to deliver back to those people, I think one of the things too is that these investors, because they're investing most of the time, historically the data we have to date is that 80% of the time these are people who are first or secondary connections to the small business owner who are making these either investments or contributions. And so these are people they have ongoing relationships with. And so there will be there's a lot of mandated disclosure, but what we're seeing are the people who are successful are the people who provide ongoing kind of fulsome disclosure in the course of doing business, because that's what people want to know.
Well, don't get me wrong. I hold a CPA, but I agree with you that an audit is an onerous requirement for a small business, and particularly when it's been ongoing for 5 years and never had an audit. And so to go back and redo all that from ground zero to establish a starting point is ridiculously expensive and would prohibit any small business from being able to utilize this. So no, I agree with you, and I think that threshold, if there isn't going to be an audit required, should be very high, because it's going to cost so much to get the money, it's not going to be worth it. Mr. Bullard?
I guess the one change I would make would be to have a $100 investment maximum, and then strip everything else out except for the requirement to do it through a mediary and the requirement to have some business plan that's at least 500 words.
I think 100 would be too small, but I hear what you're saying.
1,000 times 100, there's your 100,000.
Mr. Paul?
My suggestion would be that addressing, it may seem indirect, but addressing the portal liability issue is rather crucial to facilitating small businesses' ability to raise money. If it's not clear, we may end up with perhaps the more gunslinging actors participating in a market that we really don't want to be perceived that way. But just if we're just getting back to the audit question, the only reason that wasn't my choice was because it had already been mentioned. I think an audit should be required when it's required by the owners. I think when the market says, you know what, we're not comfortable with you, the investors, we want to see how you got here. When that happens, then I think the company should be required to. But I think setting an arbitrary cut, with respect to how much is raised feels, well, arbitrary. And it should be based more on necessity and the desire of the shareholders.
Thank you very much for your time. I completely agree that the way this is proceeding is going to make this pretty much useless to small businesses unless we make changes. I appreciate your input. I like the idea of limiting investment, but I think $100, it needs to be significantly higher than that anyway. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Mr. Rice. They're about to call votes. I think that still gives us a few minutes, because as we've all learned around here, the first 15-minute vote means a half an hour. Mr. Mulvaney, you had a couple.
I did, thank you. And I forgot, Mr. Best, you actually opened your testimony by talking about the British system and the theory that good ideas can come from any place. Would you just give us a quick summary of where you think the significant differences are between the British system and the one we've adopted, and maybe someplace where it might be better, someplace where our system might be a little bit better?
What's interesting about the British system is a lot of it has sprung up in the absence of strong regulation. And it's only this year that the British government will be issuing more formalized crowdfunding and crowdlending regulation.
The caps that we're talking about, the disclosure requirements, the liability rules are non-existent? They're organic? What are they in the British system?
Well, they are much less structured in the British system, and so what we're seeing you're seeing a wide range of investors and lenders. Now, I will say that the products of choice in the UK tend to be the loan products, the debt-based products. That's about 10 times more crowd debt as there is equity. I think there's a degree to which that is cultural, as well as the fact that for a lot of small businesses who will never have an IPO or a 10x multiple, knowing, kind of asking the question, where's my exit on this investment? If it's a debt-based product, I know that I'm going to get my loan payment every month over the next 4 years. So that makes sense as well.
To the chairman's issue on democratization of investment, you said that there's a wide array of investors in the British system. Tell us who they are. Who's participating in this, not on the issuer's end, but on the investor's end?
Well, on the largest debt-based platform in the UK is called Funding Circle. They have now raised over 180 million British pounds. That's over $250 million through their platform, and they have, I believe, it's 65,000 investors that have invested individuals into small businesses, and they come from a wide range of folks. And when you look at the average investment, it's about $3,000 US. And so these are people who are not investing large amounts of money, but are investing a few $1,000s into a local business that they're familiar with. And I think that's a size of investment that, number one, we did research a couple of years ago before the law passed just to ask people, what do you think your investment would be if you had this opportunity? And the number was between $3,000 and $4,000. So we're seeing, at least in the British system, those numbers are somewhat consistent. And so I think that, I think that while the limits may be, up to 10% of someone's restrictions, what we're seeing in the UK after tens of thousands of people have used this system, that people are going into this fairly carefully.
I heard Professor Bullard mention in his testimony that he was concerned that as something between 1/4 and 1/2 of these issuers, if I got that right, might fail. Do you happen to know the failure rate in the British system so far or not?
No, sir. I don't know the British system. I can give you some data from Australia. I think that there will be failure. Absolutely, businesses fail. We've never run away from that in this entire conversation about this. In the Australian system, they've had crowdfunded investing, a form of it, for now almost 8 years, and the platform there is called the Australian Small Scale Offering Board, and they have run about 145 companies through that platform, through that crowdfunding platform. One of the interesting things is that the survival rate of those businesses who have used that system has been 86%. It's a kind of a very surprisingly high number. And when asked about that, the CEO of the platform has said, well, he doesn't have the exact reason, but certainly believes that adding structure and transparency to a business earlier than it typically would have as a startup, because you have to sort of have a lot more structure around your business because you're now offering this security out to the public, and also the transparency of having to make regular engagement with your investors, whether it be informally or formally, provides people with better decision-making opportunities and more transparent. I'm doing this on stage. I have to do a better job. I have to live up to the expectations of the public. And so we think that we will see if that plays out in the UK system and in the US system, but it's an interesting data point.
Fascinating. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Mulvaney, and thank you for joining us. Just one last, just to take off where you were at, Mr. Best, or anyone that wants to participate. Let's articulate, so we have it on the record, what are the caps? It's $2,000?
$2,000 above $50,000, $50,000 to $100,000 in income. It's up to 5% of your annual income or net worth, and above $100,000, it's 10% of your annual income or net worth, excluding the value of your home.
Okay.
Well, there's actually a flat contradiction in the statute, so we don't really know the answer to that, which is that it says if you're either at 100 or below as to income or net worth, you're subject to the lower limit. And then the next provision says if you're either at 100 or more. Okay, so, and that the SEC resolved. Also, it's not clear what the 5% applies to.
But
there, I think the SEC should interpret it to be the greater of.
And Professor, didn't the SEC sort of broach that in their rule set?
Right, but they took the investor protection ambiguity and they ruled against more investor protection, allowing someone to invest more. But as a practical matter, what that means is someone who has $100,000 in savings would be able to invest $10,000 instead of $5,000. It's not going to be the end of the world, but I don't think the SEC, when there's such a clear ambiguity, should be erring on the side of higher investments when this is an investment protection provision.
Okay. Last thing I wanted to share, and this was actually something, and those of you who've actually been involved in intermediaries, I'm from sort of the world that believe that crowdsourcing of data and information and crowdsourcing of money and other things, there is a purifying effect of information, sunlight. And the fact of the matter is, having seen, because I've looked at some of the ones, it was actually Netherlands, Sweden, Great Britain, and many of them actually had blogs running alongside of it saying, we go to Mary's Bakery, we like this, that's why we're willing to put 1,000 pounds into this. It was a narrative that came with not only the posting and the investment. Do you believe U.S. portals will actually make sure that they also, if they're asking for egalitarian participation, democratization of investment, as you've used the term, will also be doing democratization of information and comments?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that it will be in both senses. In the example that you gave of the Mary's Bakery, there will be customers that will talk, this place is great, they make great scones, and there'll be a discussion about that. But I think that there will also be blogs or running dialogue about the offering itself, where certain people will, say, all right, so I looked at the offering and this thing doesn't totally make sense to me. Does anybody have any clarity on that? And then a dialogue, someone will respond, perhaps even the principal. And so I do think that there will be that level of transparency.
Would anyone disagree with me that particularly in this investor class, that is the ultimate type of regulation? Is, because we're all comfortable going to Yelp and others to get portions of information. And as long as they've built the, mechanics within there to avoid the scamming, that access to information as an ultimate regulator.
I think it's a great contributing factor to that level of regulation, and I think that it may come to pass that it actually ends up being something that's expected in other asset classes. I think it's going to be very successful in Title III, and I think 5, 10 years from now, that might be one of the legacies of this entire legislation, is that level of transparency is actually required for other things, which would be great.
And now we do the scamper to go vote. Hey, thank you for your participation today. Your testimony has helped us to better understand how the SEC proposal will affect the future of crowdfunding. As I shared with you earlier, I am a bit emotionally invested on this, and I really do want to move to this democratization of access to capital, where all of our U.S. citizens have the opportunity to take risk, but also benefit from that participation and risk. I will ask unanimous consent to have 5 legislative days to submit statements in support and supporting materials for the record. Do understand our office also intends to take portions of this and turn it into the SEC as part of sort of a comment coming from us. And without objection, no, you don't have to do that. The hearing is adjourned.